Hello from Tel Aviv. We have many guests today around the world. We are delighted to have you here with us. This event is dedicated to John Steiner's book, Illusion, Disillusion, and Irony in Psychoanalysis. We are here from Betipulnet, the Israel Psychotherapy Net. We host the most exciting people in our field and give voice to the most original ideas. Our series, Here and Now, Conversations on Books, Art, and Society, is mostly dedicated to launching new books. My name is Aner Govrin. I am a psychoanalyst and a member of Tel Aviv Institute for Contemporary Psychoanalysis and a director of doctoral track Psychoanalysis and Hermeneutics at Bar Ilan University. Joining us is my colleague and good friend, Sharon Ziv-Beiman. Hello, Sharon.
Hi, I'm happy to be here tonight, and I represent the voice of psychotherapy integration from Mifrasim Institute in the Academic College of Tel Aviv-Yafo, and I'm happy to collaborate for another exciting evening.
I wrote elsewhere that there are two kinds of analysts: fascinated analysts and troubled analysts. The fascinated analyst admires his or her school of thought. He or she can be fascinated by Code or by Bion or Winnicott. Fascinated analysts feel that they have found the truth. There is also a second type of analyst, the troubled analyst. Troubled analysts can also be fascinated by some theory, but something troubles them. The troubled analyst feels that something is missing from the theory, that there is some lacune, and he or she wants to fill it up. Hannah Segal, for example, was basically fascinated by Klein. She was not troubled by Klein theory. She did not find lacune in Klein's writing. She did excellent service to Klein. We all first met Klein by reading Segal's canonical book, Introduction to Melanie Klein. John Steiner, our guest today, is no doubt a troubled analyst. What troubles John? For those viewers who did not yet read the book, let me mention briefly the main points. First of all, John is troubled that because of too much admiration for truth and for the reality principle, we might just slightly overreact by throwing away our and our patients' illusions. But we do need illusions. Art, for example, is not created by the reality principle, is it? Or it is created by artists who withdraw into a world of illusion to create their own personal Garden of Eden. John also thinks that ordinary people need illusions to protect them from the harshness of life. And I think maybe the Kleinian theory lacks a concept of healthy illusion, which John writes about so passionately. John also gives special place to severe trauma, which I think Kleinian thought is lacking because of its, some say, overemphasis on fantasies and the internal world. And he writes about the importance of analysts being kind. He cites E.M. Forster in saying that truth without kindness is not fully true. Kindness is not a very common theme in Kleinian writings, is it? And you can sense that John resents those analysts who are determined to expose the truth because, in his opinion, it leads to a righteous attitude and a disregard for the subjective experience of the patient. I just wonder, who did John have in mind when he wrote that? John's book is a real gem. There are some clinical illustrations, but mostly he demonstrates his ideas by offering the reader a rich collection of literary work. It includes an excellent introduction by Jay Greenberg, And let me cite a paragraph from Greenberg's introduction. And I quote, "The choice to share his ideas about literature is a gift to his readers," writes Greenberg, "because it gives us the chance to read some great works through his eyes. Steiner moves gracefully from Sophocles to Milton to Ibsen, Keats, Cervantes, Shakespeare, and many others. At each stop, we find ourselves surprised and enlightened by the way he develops a theme in the context of works that are long familiar to us," end of quote. John Steiner is a training analyst of the British Psychoanalytical Society and the author of Psychic Retreats and Seeing and Being Seen. He has also edited and written introductions to The Oedipus Complex Today, papers by Hannah Segal, essays on Herbert Rosenfeld and Melanie Klein's lectures on technique. And John Steiner was analyzed by Hannah Segal, and he was supervised by Herbert Rosenfeld and Betty Joseph, a walking history. Not many people know that John was a neuroscientist before he became a psychoanalyst. Good evening, John. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we start with the book, we are curious to know more about your personal way and the influences that inspired you. Can you tell us more about these influences? And of course, we have a special interest in your analysis with Hannah Segal.
Okay, yes. Well, I'm very happy to be here. I'm at the moment in France, where we have both a heat wave and a coronavirus wave. So we're both affected by these external factors. And I'm not the sort of analyst that takes no notice of external factors. But if you want to know the influences, well, I suppose, I decided to do neuroscience and then psychiatry because I was a bit worried about psychoanalysis. Perhaps already I was troubled before I even began, and I wanted to be very scientific. However, eventually I became, as Aner says, I became fascinated with psychoanalysis, and the scientific basis I thought was present in psychoanalysis itself, because I thought we had to understand the laws of the mind before we could link them to the laws of the brain and to the laws of society. Now the actual analytic, well, first of all, when I was doing psychiatry, I was a student of a lively French-speaking analyst called Henry Ray. I don't know if you've ever heard of Henry Ray. He's written only one book and only half a dozen papers, but he was a huge influence on me. We might give examples later. And while I was doing psychiatry, I asked him to help me find an analyst. And he said, "Oh, well, the best analyst in London is Hannah Segal. I will ask her." So fortunately, she had a vacancy, and I began my personal analysis and then training analysis. I'm surprised that you don't think she's troubled. It's an interesting comment. You know, I admire her greatly, and she was always a very kind analyst. But she didn't seem troubled to me. And I remember one day I got angry with her, and I said, "You're never in any doubt about psychoanalysis. You don't ever question Melanie Klein. And Freud, and she got a bit short-tempered, and she said, "If I have any doubts, I'm certainly not going to share them with you." So that she showed me a bit, you see, that doubts are often a private thing. And it's very easy to express doubts publicly. But there are areas of one's mind that we prefer to keep private. And although you're interviewing me, and I think you expect me to be honest and open, it's quite clear that there are certain areas that I will remain private about, as I think is right. So Hannah Siegel had her own doubts. She, for example, she disagreed. Her best friend was Betty Joseph, but she disagreed profoundly with Betty Joseph's way of working, and also, of course, with other analysts. I think her doubts about Melanie Klein were kept more private. My first supervisor was Herbert Rosenfeld. He was quite a troubled man. He had all kind of personal difficulties. His family came from Germany to England in the 30s, before the Nazi. Well, already the Nazis were in power, but before the war began. And but when he was working well, I think he was the finest analyst I know. He had a capacity to put himself into the mind of his patient, which was quite remarkable. Now, he used to speak a great deal. You know, some analysts, especially French analysts, speak very little to their patient. They just make one or two enigmatic comments. But Herbert Rosenfeld would give long interpretations. So yes, the other influence, apart from, and Herbert, of course, was a great theoretician. One of my ideas that I developed was that of pathological organizations. And that was really Herbert Rosenfeld's idea. He called them narcissistic organizations. And one model he gave was of a narcissistic gang, like a mafia gang, as if the internal objects are organized in this gang with a leader, which the members of the gang are frightened of. So he's very important for me theoretically too. Betty Joseph became a good friend of mine, but she was always a very difficult supervisor and very critical. We were always frightened if we gave a paper. If Betty Joseph shook her head, it meant that we had strayed from the truth. She was a great follower of the truth. But she was extremely sensitive in following the fine grain, the details of the analytic session. So I think Hannah Siegel was a little bit incorporated both Betty Joseph and Herbert Rosenfeld, but very important as perhaps the most important influence on me.
Do you have any disagreements with Klein?
Yes, of course. I mean, perhaps you see, recently I edited and published a book on Klein's lectures on technique. She gave these lectures in 1936. And from these lectures, a quite different image of Klein emerged from the stereotype ones. I suppose the most important difference with Klein is this idea that illusion is harmful, and that the truth is always important. Well, of course, it's hard to object to the truth, but for example, when Klein talks about normal splitting, it's a split into an idealized and a persecutory state of mind. And of course, both of these are illusions. The idealization that Klein thinks is important for development is an illusion, but she never calls it that. I think partly I think she did this because she was afraid of the influence of some people like Winnicott and like some of the Americans' kind of interpersonal school of analysis, in which the setting became degraded and in this, you know, and she, because of that, she wanted to emphasize that illusion is harmful to the. But of course, she believed in illusion, as shown in this example of the splitting, but she didn't like to call it that. While Winnicott, she spoke a great deal about illusion, and although he does say that it is an important task of the mother to disillusion the infant, in fact, he doesn't emphasize disillusion as much as he does illusion, as if he wants to encourage illusion. So there's a kind of balance. In my view, you have to both tolerate and accept illusion, but it's not our job to either encourage it or discourage it. Our job is to understand it.
Yes. John, we have this comment from Temo from Canada. He asks you to give us your understanding or definition of illusion. He writes, it differs from analytic authors. So what is illusion?
What is an illusion? I don't know how to begin. It's somehow, sometimes these questions, you know, people say, what is beauty? Or what is truth? I think if you don't know what an illusion is, you shouldn't be in this room with us. It seems to me it's just an attitude to the world in which our fantasies are given a strength and an importance. Now, sometimes they come to be believed as if they were facts. Sometimes, and mostly, I hope, amongst colleagues, they are recognized to be illusions. They are like daydreams. We all have daydreams of being successful sometimes in sports, sometimes in war, and we love to be a hero. And these daydreams are mostly, we recognize them to be illusions, but some people actually live out their daydreams. And so that the term illusion refers to both types. It can be an illusion recognized as an illusion or a fantasy, but it can be an illusion that is recognized as a belief, and often with a narcissistic kind of superiority connected with it. So these are all, but I'm not sure I can define what an illusion is. I'm not very good at definitions.
If you can tell us, what is the aim of the Kleinian therapy, of the Kleinian method, and And do you differ? Is there a difference between you and Melanie Klein in the aim of the Kleinian method?
Well, I've written a paper on the aim of psychoanalysis, it would be take a whole hour to go through it all. But the basic idea I have is that our mental space is distorted by all kinds of defensive organizations. And the most important of these have what the Kleinians call projective identification. That is when elements of the personality are split off and attributed to other people. So we lose that capacity. If that is excessive, the personality is often felt to be empty or weak or confused. We don't know who we are. We have a poor sense of identity. So one of the aims one can formulate in analysis is that the aim of the analysis should be to restore the self to the individual. You see, the traditional idea is, and for example, Klein's idea, I think, was clear. She thought that the aim of analysis is to modify the superego. She thought we suffer from an extremely severe superego that punishes us and makes us miserable and guilty. And she wants to liberate the individual from this severe superego.
It's a Freudian view, isn't it?
Yes, of course, it's basically Freudian, but Freud's idea was a little bit different. His idea was where id was, there ego shall be. He was really perhaps, he emphasized the intellectual side of the personality, and he thought he wanted to make the unconscious conscious. Now, of course, this is an important approach, and we all agree with that, but Klein had more interest in this severe superego, and she thought the analyst, through his lacking the severity of the primitive superego, could modify the superego. She basically followed Strachey's idea about mutative interpretations. Now, my view is that it's a bit different, you see. It's a bit, I think, the superego can look after itself, provided we regain the strength. For example, sometimes we need to rebel against the superego. We have to, if we want the superego to be kinder, it's unrealistic. We have to be stronger. And the most primitive superego, I think, never changes. Klein herself said that at some point. But what happens is the ego becomes stronger and says, I will not obey the superego. And of course, that's a whole process in itself, because when the ego rebels against the superego, it's like the son murdering the father. And I believe that this is necessary for development, that each generation has to escape from the influences of their parents to form their own identity. And unconsciously, that's an Oedipal murder. And the development that the aim of psychoanalysis is, as it were, to support the patient through that process of having to murder your father, having to mourn him, having to go through the regret and pain, and eventually having to bury the father and move to the next generation to become a father yourself. So that's in a way and in the process, it's only when you mourn the loss of the object that you regain the parts of the self that you had projected.
And John, what is the way the ego has to do with the mother?
Sorry? The mother?
Yeah.
Well, that's another whole interesting subject. See, Freud talked about the father a great deal. As you know, Klein talks about the mother a great deal. I believe that I feel that my own approach is that we all have a bisexuality in which both male and female elements, in both men and women, there are male and female elements. Of course, these differ in females, they're different than in males, but they're present in both. And I think the superego is made up of both maternal and paternal elements.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting is, but also the relationship between them. So there are, in one's internal world, there is a mother and a father and a couple who may be harmonious or may be compliant or may be untruthful or may be kind or severe. And this is how the superego is constructed, so that it has both of these elements in it. I think it's interesting that Freud, I think, undervalued the feminine, which of course was typical of his age, of the period of the time. Klein, I think, was perhaps the most important influence to restore the feminine and to understand the importance of the mother.
So if the aim of analysis or therapy is to strengthen the ego, what in therapy enables this process? How therapy strengthens the ego?
Yeah. Well, to answer that, I find the most instructive way is to read Freud's Mourning and Melancholia, because this is a wonderful paper, and he describes that in the process of mourning, he says, we have to bring out every memory of the lost object and apply the verdict of reality to it. Now, I think that what our modern view is that what we have to do is that with each memory, we have to take back what has been projected. And in the process of working through the loss of an object, it becomes apparent what belonged to the object and what belongs to the subject. And so we take back Freud had a libido theory. He said, we put the libido into the object, and we have to take the libido back into but I think contemporary analysts don't think about libido much. We think more it's an object relationship, and that we project something into the object. Now, with the mourning of the object, we apply the verdict of reality, and we take back what belonged to us and differentiated what belonged to the object. And that's a very painful and difficult thing to do and requires work. That's the work of mourning. And I think it's the work of analysis. It's what we do in analysis. I think of it as we have every loss, every between sessions, within a session, every time we feel we've lost the analyst, even when we feel the analyst fails to understand us. That's a loss, isn't it? And then we have to work through these losses. And each time we do, a little bit of self is returned to the ego and strengthens it. I think it's the process of mourning that strengthens the ego and allows it then to rebel. If the ego is weak, it can't rebel.
So from a relational perspective, if I would like to ask you if this working through process is influenced by who is the object, if the subjectivity of the analyst or the other can construct completely different therapeutic processes.
Well, that's basically you're asking this internal-external question. You know, are there internal factors? I mean, could you have an analysis with a computer? Or do you have to have a personal relationship? And does the quality of the person affect it? And well, I don't know. I can't imagine an analysis where the quality is unimportant. I think but quite which qualities is very interesting to ask. You know, do you need to have an intelligent analyst? What if your analyst was a little bit slow? Do you have to have a kind analyst? Do you have to have a self-doubting analyst? You know, I think Aner was. I think he thinks some analysts are too fascinated, and they don't doubt. And I think all those are very interesting and important things. And of course, what changes in the course of an analysis will depend on both the individual and on the analyst.
And you yourself worked more like Betty Joseph with the here and now, or more like Hannah Segal with past interpretations and fantasies? Were you influenced by more the analyst or the supervisor?
Well, of course, you don't have to believe me, because I might say something and do something else.
Of course.
But my conscious belief is that what Betty Joseph was able to do was to follow the fine grain of the session. So you see, when I talk about mourning, I don't mean the death of a person or even the loss of the analyst over a holiday or a weekend. If you follow the session minutely, you can see, the analyst has disappeared, or the analyst has got something wrong, or the analyst has fallen asleep, or is busy with his own anxiety, see? And already that's a minute loss. So there I'm very much influenced by Betty Joseph. On the other hand, Betty Joseph was so afraid of the setting being distorted by theory that she almost had no theory at all, or she claimed she had no theory. But I'm a great believer in theory, but in a theory that lies in the background, you know, that we don't apply literally, but it's always affecting our attention, what we're attending to. So I think I admire Betty, but I believe we need to modify our observation to give it some kind of structure, to provide a structure in which we work and which the patient then feels safe. And that's through giving it meaning. Of course, she did give things meaning, but she claimed she didn't.
Yes. Can we let's talk about your new book.
Thank you, yeah.
Can you tell us what it is about?
Well, you know, my interests have developed, you know, but they've developed from my previous approach, and they've always been clinical, although you point out that there's less clinical material in this book and more literature. That's because I've retired. I'm now 86 years old, and I don't see analytic patients anymore. I still supervise. I conduct seminars, and I write regularly. But because I don't have my own patients now, I can't find clinical material. I don't like using supervisors' clinical material and so on. So I've turned to literature, but I always did a bit of both. I tried to connect the clinical and you see, my interest first was in these psychic retreats, a kind of refuge where the patient withdrew into a fantasy world. And some of these fantasy worlds were idealized worlds. You know? And I, in the book, and my second approach was then, why is it so difficult to come out of these psychic retreats and rejoin reality? And I found there were two facts. One is that when you are no longer in a retreat, you see the world more accurately and you see the objects more clearly. But the other thing I realized was you also are exposed to being seen, and that being seen is a very important immediate consequence. It's like we come out of a shell like a snail and then we withdraw again because we're very frightened of embarrassment and humiliation. And that led me then to look at, I became interested in Milton's poem Paradise Lost, because I thought that's the sort of prime example of coming out of a psychic retreat, coming out of the Garden of Eden. And the first thing that Adam and Eve realize is that they are ashamed because they realize they are naked. And it was only after they ate of the tree of knowledge. So once they had knowledge, they began to realize the truth of what, they began to realize, I think, that the Garden of Eden was an illusion. So then I became interested in the way our idealized illusions can sometimes dominate our mental attitude. And that's what you talked about, fascinated analysts. If we become too fascinated, we live in an illusion. And then we try to modify that by introducing a more objective view. So that then led me to the area of illusion, and particularly this, what I call the Garden of Eden illusion, which once you look at more closely, you realize how unreal it is. And not only how unreal it is, but how terribly boring and uncreative the Garden of Eden is.
And it happens to every infant, right?
I think so. I think that this is a developmental, it's connected then with Melanie Klein's idea of primal splitting, that the world is divided into idealized and persecuting, which in the biblical mythology is in heaven and hell. And there has to be a hell because otherwise you can't have a heaven. And that's where you have this primal splitting. And I agree with Klein that this is a developmental process, but I also became interested in the extreme trauma that disillusion can have, that if we lose this idealized psychic retreat, it can be extremely traumatic, and it can throw us into a kind of abyss of chaos and confusion. And it led me, you see, although I'm using literature, it led me to observe clinically, because, for example, when I supervise analytic work, it's not uncommon to find some idealization then followed by a confusional state. And you can see that something's happened to the idealization, and that the analyst then has to deal with the confusion and the chaos, sometimes even the disintegration, the fragmentation. So that's where I got to. Now the next thing that I became interested in, Milton was a great believer in the literal reality of God. For him, God was real and existed and was the basis of experience of a good object. And it's striking, if you then read Klein, you come to see that she had exactly the same idea. She said the good breast, the ideal breast, becomes the support for the ego as it becomes internalized and becomes the source of goodness and the source of generosity and creativity. Now, I would again modify it, like when Sharon asked about the mother. It's not just the God the Father, but it's the relationship between mother and father in the internal world that becomes the source of creativity. But what struck me was how similar Milton and Klein were in this idea that the ideal object. Now then I just made another kind of observation, and that is that in order for the object to be internalized as a symbol, it has to be relinquished as a possession. And that goes back to this point about mourning that we talked about earlier. It's only when you relinquish the omnipotent fantasy that you can let the object go, let it die, and then it's internalized as a symbol rather than as a concrete object. And that was both Milton and Klein, in my view, understood this. That the good object, for some people, God, is no longer a concrete object, but is a symbol of perfect goodness, a kind of measure. Like in Paris, there's the measure of 1 meter. We know exactly what a meter is because it's it used to be, now it's some atomic number, but so this internal good breast of God is a measure of goodness rather than actually something we can acquire.
Yes.
All our cultures warn us against the omnipotent possession of the good object. The Greeks called it hubris. We call it omnipotence. And when Eve ate of the apple, she was wanting to be a goddess. She was rebelling against the authority she was the first heroine, Eve. But she then had to realize that she had wanted to be a god, and that had to be relinquished, which is exactly what happens. Adam and Eve are expelled from this illusion into the real world.
Speaking about omnipotence, you give, I think, a very interesting a clinical case of Mr. A, the most ambitious and most ambitious patient of yours. Can you tell our viewers more about Mr. A and what did you want to demonstrate through him about, I think, the hero?
Well, it's hard to do this because Mr. A was in a long analysis, and but the point I illustrate in the book, the bits of material, is the way he felt obliged to be a hero. And in that way, the example I give is when his son had difficulty finding a job. And Mr. A had very bad relationship with his wife. They were separated, and he always wanted to be allowed to return, and his wife never wanted him. But then his wife said to him, "You must help your son get a job. You can pull strings." He was in a position. He knew a lot of important people in the government and in business. And he knew this was wrong. He said, "It's wrong because my son can manage without this." But he also felt a kind of duty to his son. But most of all, he felt that he had to comply with his wife's demand. So he went and he started to arrange some interviews for his son. To his surprise, or not such surprise, his son was furious. He thought this was an intrusion. It was not what he wanted. And the patient then collapsed. It became a disaster, catastrophic. And you see, this is an example, I think, of this idealized. He had an idealized fantasy. I will get my son a job. My wife will then forgive me for all the disagreements. We will reunite and form an idyllic fantasy again. So when that collapses, you get this catastrophic collapse. And that was the pattern for a lot of his analysis. He would start a project and then there'd be a catastrophic collapse. Now, what gradually happened is that, for example, when he, it's a long story, but you see, one of the things the Kleinians try to do is they try to pick up the pattern that the patient describes in relation with his wife and his son. They see it as an example of a much more primordial pattern. It's an Oedipus situation, isn't it? There's the son, the mother, and the father. And we try to then look at how is this pattern expressed in the transference. And this patient was about to go on a business trip to Germany, and he was going to miss a Friday session. And I took it up in that he was very excited about going to Germany. And I thought he wanted me to admire him so he and I could become this idyllic couple. And then the son would be looked after. But of course, I interpreted it all went wrong, see, because he actually was like Oedipus killing his father, or like the omnipotent son destroying his father. So we worked through all that, and to his enormous relief, when he came back from Germany, his son apologized to the father and said, "I'm sorry because I know you were trying to help me, and it was not a disaster at all." And it enabled a whole theme to develop, which in fact had to do with his father's role in the war. His father was part of the Normandy invasion, and then to the military advance towards Germany, and which eventually led to the German defeat. But his father suffered a great deal from the trauma of the war, and but the patient became much more thoughtful. For example, there were at that time anniversary meetings to commemorate the end of the war. And then he had the thought, well, soon all the veterans will be dead. There'll be nobody to come to these anniversary meetings. And I linked that then with the the recognition of mortality, and that one day the analysis will end and his analyst will die, and that he'll have to manage on his own. I can't fix jobs for him anymore. So there was then it became connected with mourning. And that's where I think the mutative work gets done. Because in the process of mourning, he becomes less dependent on me and more, his ego is strengthened and he can make his own judgments.
How did you react to his yearning for your admiration?
That's a very good question. I think it's important to how I reacted, I don't know, because often one gets very irritable with this yearning for admiration, because partly it's a kind of collusion with omnipotence. But also part of the approach to illusion is, and this is in my chapter on the journey of the hero, that the hero has to be able both to embrace omnipotence and to go a bit mad, but he has to then return to reality. If he stays mad, it's not, he doesn't achieve anything real. Now, I think Sharon earlier talked, was it you, Sharon, about the artist, and that, that the artist has to be able to engage in fantasy, to be creative. But see, if the artist doesn't come back to reality, there's no work of art. And this is something Hannah Siegel wrote about. She suggested that the artist is able to go mad, but he comes back and it's his craft. He puts a frame around his painting. And it's only because he's a craftsman and understands reality very well that the fantasy becomes communicable. So I think it's the same thing. I try to approach the wish for admiration, which to recognize that it's important, but also to help the patient, as it were, realize it's a kind of demand for omnipotent solutions based on a failure of reality solutions. And this patient gradually became less omnipotent and less demanded admiration. In some of my work, I think especially in the Don Quixote chapter in the book, I make a distinction between the longing for love and the longing for admiration. And Don Quixote is completely enmeshed in the longing for admiration. He wants to be the great hero. And I often think it's when there's a failure of love and a lack of confidence, because if a patient feels loved, he doesn't have to be the greatest. Some people have to be the greatest and be, and sometimes what happens is that a gradual belief that one is loved makes admiration less necessary.
But from where do you think that this love should come from the therapist? Is therapy a source of love?
You ask all these loaded questions. It must come from the therapist, but it's not the therapist, it's the internal mother that was projected into the therapist, and eventually it has to come from, it's got to do with self-love, doesn't it? If you are able to love yourself, and if you have internalized a loving mother and a loving father and a loving couple, then of course the capacity to be loved is stronger. But you also have to recognize that hate exists at the same time. So you need to be loved, but you also have to be strong enough to be hated, so that the love and hate are both enter into the relationship, that make admiration less important. You have to be able to be loved, but you also have to survive hatred. And that's all part of a containing setting. That's why Klein and Analyst think the setting is so important. We offer regular sessions. We always start on time. We have predictable breaks. It's all as stable and regular as possible. And then any disruptions of the setting, we try to understand the effect. Often it leads to a loss of confidence and then has to be worked through again.
Yeah. But, you know, from a postmodern perspective, to what extent the analyst is a real person with whom we practice love and hate and the ability to hold both of them, and to what extent is he represent the internal objects. I think it's the debate between postmodern and modern perspectives on.
Yes, but I think you're more talking about how we talk about these things. I mean, when you say the analyst should be a real person, how can you not be a real person? You might be a real person who pretends he's not a real person. But in the end, but what I think you're talking about is the way analysts speak to their patients. You see, some analysts speak as if they're not a real person. You know, that's, I was impressed by Hannah Siegel. She always spoke her mind. She never tried to be neutral. In her waiting room, there was the New Statesman and Nation, which was a very left-wing newspaper. She didn't pretend she had no political opinions. She would go on protest marches against nuclear war. And, you know, so she gave her opinion. Some analysts think that they have to be enigmatic, but they, of course, they are real people. It's just how they talk about it to their patients.
We have another question from the audience. Aya asked, did it ever happen to you actually to admire a patient? Isn't it possible at all?
Of course. I mean, I'm surprised that anyone should ask that question. You know, even Mr. A, you know, Mr. A came extremely disabled to the analysis, but he was a man of some substance, and he in fact started I can't tell you all because of confidentiality, but he started a project that became internationally known and respected. And I admired him greatly, but he was also a damaged individual, you know? So that I could also see how inhibited his creativity was by his conflict. But indeed, I often interpret to patients that, see, Klein thought one of the most important sources of destructive impulses was envy. And of course, people talk about the patients envying the analyst, but the analyst also envies the patient. And it's important to analyze that. And often we envy their creativity, we envy their youth, we envy their sexual capacities, all kinds of things. So there's a great deal of admiration connected with envy. What we try to do in analysis is we try to interpret rather than express admiration. But we don't deny its presence.
And you think the patient feels your admiration even though you don't express it?
Well, I do. I express it through interpretations. I will, and also, it's a complex. It would take a great deal to describe how, through the process of interpretation, we explore the issue, say, of admiration. So we could explore the patient's wish to be admired. Now, and we would describe, for example, that he had lots of qualities that deserve admiration, so that it wasn't a false idea that he should be admired, but we also connected with the fantasy that if he was admired, it would change the world. And suddenly he and his wife would get together and there'd be a Garden of Eden and his son would be successful and so on. So the magical connotations of admiration would be explored. It's a complex, I mean, these things are worked through slowly and gradually, and often with a lot of mistakes. You see, sometimes, for example, I give an example with the same patient. He came in one day talking about road rage. He was, do you use that expression in Israel? It's when you get angry with another car. And he said that when he always comes and he always gives way to the other car. And if another car gives way to him, he always waves, thank you. But then he said that he's noticed that some drivers never say thank you, and they're always, and then he said, and I've noticed that most of these drivers are black. And he said, I don't want you to think I'm a racist. And of course, he was very left-wing in his politics, and he was not at all racist in his theories, but he was quite racist in relation to these things. And I started trying to analyze his racism, you see. And I linked it with my Jewishness and his anti-Semitic ideas and all kinds of things. And he was furious with me. He says, nothing to do with racism. You don't understand. So it took a long time for us to recognize that I had misunderstood. And it was... It had to do with quite different issues.
It's a sort of negation, isn't it? When you say, I'm not this or I'm not that.
That's right. But it was also a failure to recognize that racism is a universal attitude to someone who's different. And that we all have to combat our racism as best we can, because it's a universal propensity. The more we understand it, the more we educate ourselves, the less we're likely to act it out. There was quite an amusing end to that session. He described how when he was a student, he was in Germany, and he had to take a motorbike exam, although he'd been riding a motorbike in England for years. But the Germans said, you have to get a motorbike license, you have to do an exam. And for this exam, he had to have a pillion rider on the seat behind him, and they had to go slowly between cones. And he failed the exam, and he was furious. He said, because it's an unnatural situation, you know. And then, of course, I linked it to the idea that I was sitting behind him and he had to go slowly, and he was not used to going slowly. He was always racing. But also he then said, and these bloody Germans, he said, they think they own the roads. And then he realized, he said, well, he stopped. He said, well, perhaps the Germans do own German roads. And I connected. I said, well, perhaps this is my consulting room, and I make the rules about when the session begins and when it ends and so on. But with your acceptance, you accept this because this is the way I work. This is how I work best. And he said, well, yes, I suppose it is your bloody consulting room. And it was quite a moment of reconciliation between us after a furious row, a kind of road rage between us.
Yes. One of your chapters deals with trauma, external trauma, violence and abuse, and you seem to give a special place for trauma, and maybe here you depart from Klein, because what came into my mind is narrative of a child analysis where Klein described her treatment of little Richard at age 10 during World War II. And though Richard was traumatized by the bombing and the war, Klein insisted on interpretations of his symptoms only from his fantasies and Oedipal conflicts. So here you seem to pretty much depart from her.
Well, you keep wanting to find departures. Everybody wants to find those things. I don't think I depart from her. I don't think, I mean, it's true. She emphasized the internal fantasies, but so do I. But she didn't minimize the external trauma, and she recognized very well that Richard was terribly disturbed by the bombings. In fact, when Mrs. Klein went on a visit to London, Richard was very upset and worried that would she be safe in London. And she interpreted this, of course, in terms of his fantasies, but obviously it was connected with the bombings in London. So the Kleinians, I think, are terribly influenced by the idea of an external reality. It's a misunderstanding but you see, in my paper on the trauma of Oedipus, what I pointed out was that when there's a real trauma, the unconscious fantasy of disillusion is reawoken by the trauma, so that a real trauma makes the Garden of Eden fantasy even more desperate. See, because if you live in a traumatic world, you create more islands of idealization. And I point out that in the Oedipus myth, see, it wasn't just that Oedipus had his life saved after he was exposed on the mountain to die with his feet pierced with a pin, but he was adopted by the king of Corinth, and he was brought up in a luxury environment, and every want was provided, just like in the Garden of Eden. The only thing that he was not allowed to discover was his origins. You see, and that's the same, that's like he was not allowed to eat of the tree of knowledge. So that what I'm trying to say is that the trauma and reality are always present. And you only have to look at the traumatic environment we're now living in, with the COVID, but also with all the innumerable wars and famines and terrible things happening in the world. I mean, I find it every time I listen to the news, I'm traumatized. It's such a horrible world that we live in.
So,
but
John,
how could you imagine that was not important? But of course, it gains its importance by the interaction with our fantasy world. And the more traumatic the world is, the more we turn to fantasy as escape to psychic retreats. So the trauma actually makes it more important to understand unconscious fantasies.
So, John, one of our, I think it was Gabriela, asked, relating to this movement between illusion and disillusion, and your view that trauma make sometimes fantasy more excessive because they are defensive.
Yeah.
What she asked, what was first, the illusion or the disillusion? What was the first stone, the illusion or the disillusion?
I don't know. You see, it's like asking how many angels can fit on a pin. You know, you see, I don't know what happens first. By the time the patient is in your consulting room, lying on your couch, or even if you're doing child analysis, by that time, there's an interplay between illusion and disillusion, and we don't know what happens first. Some people, you know, think the being inside the womb is an ideal place. Even Ferenczi wrote about how wonderful, how the being inside the womb is the Garden of Eden. You know, we have every desire satisfied. I think that's crazy. I mean, I don't know. But some people do have this fantasy. I once went to the Science Museum in London, and they had a room that was modeled on a womb, like the mother's womb, and you could go inside the womb. And it was a terribly noisy, horribly, there would the mother's breathing, there was the heartbeat, there was the bowel movements, then the uterus would contract, and, you know, suddenly the baby was squeezed. It was a terrible place. And nothing was related to the need of the baby. If the mother's was running for a bus, her heart beat, but it was nothing to do. So there was no connection between the baby's desire and the mother's provision. See? So I think this is part of the way analysts also have a fantasy of a perfect time, a Garden of Eden. Some of them put it in the womb. So you see, those people who say illusion happened in the womb, and when you were born, see, I think it was Rank or somebody thought birth trauma was the answer to everything. As if from this Garden of Eden, you then were born into reality. But I think that's the analyst fantasy. I think...
John, I think main theme in the book, which I think it's very important to focus on, is that your offer that to help the patient to cope with this dialectic tension between the need of illusion and the need to disillusion and to meet reality and the tragedy of meeting reality. You suggest that human generally through art or through therapy need some kind of process that will enable them to participate and be detached concurrently or time after time, or to find a balance between taking part and observing, between the observing and the participation. And you offer that analysts or therapists are helping the patient through facilitating this process of being part of and observing on. And you make some comparison to art or literature. Can you reflect more on that and on this idea and its contribution to therapy?
Yes, well, those are some of the what I think is a kind of clinical approach to the individual patient that is similar to some of, say, for example, when we read a novel or when we go to the theater, particularly if we see a great theater, like a tragedy, that in the process, I suggest we begin by putting ourselves inside the patient's mind. We identify with the patient, and we try to understand what the patient's experience is like. So like we do with the theatre, if you take the Oedipus play, we put ourselves in the position of Oedipus and we imagine what he's going through. But at the same time, or perhaps afterwards or before, we detach ourselves from the play and we detach ourselves from and we try to observe it from the outside, not from being in the play. So that I think this is very much what we do clinically. We put ourselves into the mind of the patient. We try to understand what's going on there, what he's experiencing. And then we come out and we observe it from a separate point of view. And out of that, they combine those two experiences. We try to formulate an interpretation. And I believe this is a general, it's a way of general quality of human relationships. Whenever we relate to another person, we try to put ourselves in their positions. Like now, you see, I'm trying to imagine what's it like in Tel Aviv, or of course, people, it's not like it used to be. They're from all over their own homes, aren't they? So it's harder for me to imagine. I thought of you all in one room like it used to be. But see, I try to imagine you, and then I come back and I say, well, what are these Israelis, what is their attitude? And there's all this, these questions, why are they asking? So I'm also observing you, and out of that I try to create an image, a model.
And you think that this position is helping to cope with the tension between the need to make illusions and to meet reality?
Yes, I think so. I think when in the process of empathy, we don't try to ask, is this an illusion or not? We engage, we say, you know, this patient was desperate to please his wife because he wanted so much to be the good father and the good husband. See? And when you withdraw, you realize it was a completely unrealistic way of doing it. But you could sympathize with his wish to do so, with the illusion that he could do that. You see, the problem is how to have these two attitudes at the same time. Because it's not that we believe in the illusion and we believe in reality. We believe in a kind of complicated relationship between illusion and reality, which is very interesting. I wrote a paper about the imposter, you know, somebody who pretends he's something else, who knowingly makes a false representation of himself. And it's a very complex thing because often these people know very well what they're doing. And the whole issue, the relationship with reality, see, is a graded one. One of my early papers was called Turning a Blind Eye, where I suggested that often we know about reality, just as Oedipus did, but he chose not to look at it. So that these two entering into the illusion and then observing the illusion are all part of what we how we engage with the real world. One of my arguments, and it's perhaps too complicated, but is that the capacity for irony is what allows us to connect these two worlds, the subjective world and the objective world. Because in irony, we can recognize both attitudes. But that's maybe too big a subject.
So why irony and not empathy?
Well, empathy is just one. Empathy is the engagement subjectively. What irony is the connection between the objective and the subjective. So when we know that we're engaging in an illusion, we know it's an illusion because we've come out and observed it, then it's both an illusion and it's a truth. See, it's remarkable that if you read Paradise Lost, for example, God is represented as omnipotent and always good and always to be admired and loved. But he's also represented as a tyrant who punishes severely. And both these attitudes are simultaneously there. And the only way you can reconcile them is by an ironic attitude, where you recognize God can be, it's all very well that he's a good person, but why is he so tyrannical? Why does he forbid knowledge to Adam and Eve?
One question from the audience. There is a question if you differentiate between, I think that in some ways you relate to this, but I will represent the question. If you differentiate between healthy illusion and pathological illusion. I think we related to this, but if you can expand the view on this differentiation.
Well, this is a value judgment, isn't it? That's the analyst or the observer is making a value judgment of what is healthy and what is pathological. See? And if the patient rebels against the analyst, it's called unhealthy, but from another point of view, it might be healthy. So what I think is that a healthy illusion is one that is not held so fundamentally that it can't be relinquished. It's to do with the flexibility. Mm-hmm. It's not to do with the extreme. Sometimes you see a new idea is if you think of an idea like Darwin's natural selection, he was for 20 years, he didn't dare to publish because he thought it would overthrow God. And you might say that was the most crazy idea imaginable, but eventually he could introduce reality to it by going hundreds of examples, this example and this example, and then the weight of evidence showed that it was not a crazy idea. So whether it's healthy or unhealthy is very hard to evaluate. Of course, there are other qualities, aren't they? Some omnipotent ideas are terribly cruel. They're to do with subjection and cruelty to people that you think are different to yourself. And you can feel uncomfortable with those kind. You can sort of call them pathological, but it's jolly hard to tell because who are we to tell? We are also subject to healthy and unhealthy illusions. The analyst isn't immune from this. So these judgments of healthy and unhealthy or true and false, they're very difficult to substantiate except with detailed analysis with the patient.
We are here near the end of our discussion today. And I have one more question which I'm curious about. There is a myth that Kleinians live long life, more than the average person. What is your secret, John?
Oh, I didn't know that myth, yes. I don't know. Hannah Siegel group was 92, I think, and Betty Joseph was 96 when she died. Klein wasn't that old, was she? Klein was just 80, I think. I'm not sure. I don't know if it's true. I'm very happy to have managed to live to 86, and I'm still healthy. But, you know, nobody can count how many days there are left. And this is a terrible world, isn't it, at the moment? Just to say that Klein's last paper was on loneliness. And interestingly, she thought one of the reasons we're lonely is we have to give up the idea of a Garden of Eden illusion. We don't have that to console us. But is that, you know, it sounds like a cheerful song, and these cheerful people are looking at lonely people. But you see, it's not a cruel song. It's a sympathetic song because they know what it's like to be lonely. And that's why it has this ironic quality, which gives it such a human, it's a story of loneliness, not from a superior position. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for a meaningful evening, John.
Good. Bye.
And I think that your message that as clinician we have to deal very carefully with truth and not to rush into it will go with me forever.
Well, that's a good idea, isn't it? Don't rush into anything.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Goodbye.
Bye for now.